point is that ISIS is about as paradigmatically modern a phenomenon as one might imagine. From its social media broadcast apocalyptic utopianism to its desire to erase and surge across the artificial nation-state boundaries whose colonial creation helped establish the conditions for its existence, ISIS is nothing so much as a creature of transnational globalization, together with the fragile states and inflamed intercommunal hostilities left in globalization's wake. Well-known global patterns of colonial divide and conquer strategies employed from Latin America and all around eastward to the Pacific Rim have helped to carve profound scars within the Middle East that ISIS and other of today's self-interested intervening actors, for ISIS can be viewed as yet another foreign interventionist, work to deepen and infect. One could easily start long before the 20th century by drawing attention not merely to Western empires such as Britain and France, but of course also their rivals like Russia and the Ottomans. However, given the stress that, as Martin spoke about, that ISIS itself lays on eradicating the 1916 Sykes-Picot borders, enshrining Western colonial designs over the Middle East, perhaps this is as salient a landmark to pinpoint as any. Of course, some might say that the Islamic State's propagandistic claim is inaccurate, because once the Great War ended, that secret agreement among the British, French, Italians, and Romanov Russia was superseded by quite different League of Nations mandate boundaries, which, if anything, gave Britain and France even more direct and expansive control over newly invented territorial prototypes of present-day Syria and Iraq. Whatever the case, the 1920s saw France cleave that which thwarted post-war Syrian nationalists had envisioned as Greater Syria into two portions. Lebanon, a Mediterranean enclave disproportionately dominated by Maronite Christians closely associated with Paris, and Syria, in which the Sunni Arab majority was kept off balance by France's granting a special influence in local administration to minorities, such as the Bashar al-Assad's family's previously disadvantaged Alawi forebears. Alawis comprising an offshoot of Shi'ism, but one that, as a syncretic admixture with other faiths, is viewed heretically by some Shia as well as Sunnis. As for the British, not only did they cut western and eastern Palestine, the latter soon to be renamed Transjordan, off of southern Greater Syria, they further claimed a Mesopotamian, that is Iraqi prize, in which southern Shia and northern Kurds, as well as central Sunnis, were placed under the rule of an implanted Sunni monarch, Faisal. Faisal's sovereignty owed largely to Winston Churchill's belief that he would be subject to effective manipulation, as well as consolation for his having just previously been turned out of Damascus by the French. Following Syria's post-World War II independence and Iraq's transition from a 1930s constitutional monarchy to what Iraqi nationalist narratives have tended to view as true independence when the monarchy was overthrown in 1958, it is difficult to think of periods when the countries have not been buffeted by interventionism. Further, each country has itself acted as an interventionist power in ways where the resultant worsening of intercommunal divides manifests in the rise of and reactions against ISIS. Thus, during the period that Syria served as a key strategic asset and ideological protege of the Soviets during the Cold War, Bashar al-Assad's father Hafez began Syria's 30-year run as a power broker for Shi'i interests in strife-torn Lebanon, while also crushing Sunni uprisings at home. Shi'i Iran's Islamic Revolution in 1979 and subsequent pivotal role in helping to create and sponsor the Shi'i movement Hezbollah following Israel's 1982 invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon suggest why Iran and Hezbollah remain as the Assad regime's preeminent regional backers and as implacable foes of ISIS. By contrast, support on the Syrian battlefield from, above all, Saudi Arabia and Qatar as Tehran's Sunni rivals in what analysts have increasingly been terming the new Middle East Cold War has been vital to the existence of ISIS. While ISIS treats Raqqa, Syria, as its effective capital, as Martin alluded to, al-Qaeda in Iraq is indeed the seedbed made fertile from the United States deposing of Saddam Hussein and from which the distinct Sunni militancy of ISIS has most immediately grown. Ironically inheriting the mantle of Sunni Arab power in Baghdad that had been bestowed by Britain originally, Saddam's persecution of Shia and Kurds was highlighted by his attack on Iran in 1980, his infamous brutality against both Shia and Kurds during the resulting 8-year conflict, as well as following his 1991 Gulf War loss to the United States. Saddam's rapid fall, together with the U.S. purging of his Sunni Ba'athist compatriots, and post-Saddam Shi'i brutality having turned the tables on Sunnis in Iraq, has indeed created a hothouse for the cultivation of a vengeful and militarily powerful and capable ISIS. Today, as a supposedly less brutal Shi'i regime in Baghdad seeks to retake Iraqi territory from the would-be caliphate, it is difficult to see how a fight of this consequence would other than hinge on support from Baghdad's now patron Tehran. The question of what Canada might stand to gain by becoming further ensnared in this morass is difficult to answer, to be sure. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Is ISIS connected with the interventions of outside powers inside Syria and Iraq right now?
Of course, Syria and Iraq have become sites for proxy wars. But, I mean, above all, I think singling out particular powers, Iran stands out to me above all. And that's the reason I ended with it, not least because there's very significant strategic wrangling between Iran and the United States right now over who should be able to exert its interventionist power the most in Iraq. So as the Iraqi government gears up for an attempt to retake Tikrit, perhaps in the future Mosul, there has been a decided engagement by Baghdad with Iran in favor over the United States. And I think arguably Iran has as much, perhaps more at stake strategically and ideologically than any other country in the neighborhood of Syria and Iraq. I'm also struck by Egypt, a country we haven't mentioned yet tonight, but of course Egypt, with respect to the supposed presence of ISIS in Libya, now stands as one of the major potential interventionist actors. Turkey, very significant. Thinking about the relationship between the domestic electoral cycle and a number of interventionist or potentially interventionist powers. I think of course, Canada, the United States, and one more country that hasn't been mentioned tonight other than very, very briefly, I think potentially significant is, of course, Israel. You know, the emphasis on securitization through which Prime Minister Netanyahu legitimates his continuing administration, I think is a potentially significant factor to think about how Israel might imaginably get involved as well.